All right, we're rolling.
All right.
Whew. It was hot today. Yeah. Well, I think I know why. It's because last week the furnace wasn't on, and so I set the set point to 70, and I think 70 is too much. So I'm gonna change it to like 68 or 67, something like that. Yeah, even. Yeah. I don't want folks to be freezing in there, but I've got so many layers on that it gets quite uncomfortable. Okay, whew. I just I just realized so this was the first year in many years in which I actually preached on the Reformation Sunday text. I usually go pull the ordinary 21 or whatever is up because I don't have an issue with that text. It's just that it's a lot of John is a sermon unto itself, right? I mean, because John has so much exposition in it. But I always have a hard time preaching on John because it's like he already, gave a sermon. Well, why do I need to give a sermon for his sermon? But I don't know. I was inspired this time, I guess. So, but then I realized I preached on that text, but I didn't actually say anything about the Reformation. So, yeah, which was kind of intentional, I suppose. I mean, well, how do you? I mean, part of the problem is I've done the Reformation sermon so many times. Like you can only preach the constantly reforming sermon so many times before you start to go crazy. And maybe you've all forgotten it, but it's right up here for me, and so I just can't do it. I mean, it's a good sermon, but oh man, coffee tastes good this morning. Is it? That's why it's good. Okay. Before we get rolling with biblical law, I wanted to actually talk about something from the sermon real quick because somebody had a question for me after the service, and it occurred to me that perhaps one of the things could use some clarification. And part of my problem is that, especially talking about like that Bonhoeffer stuff, I've got that all up here, and so I forget that sometimes I actually need to give a little bit more background than I do because I know what I'm talking about. Why don't you know exactly what I'm talking about? And also when I'm trying to squeeze things in for time, I also tend to drop things. But we talked about this when we walked through Bonhoeffer's Ethics, if you recall. But that was many years ago now. We should do that again at some point. I love talking about that stuff. But Bonhoeffer's conversation around the concept of truth is absolutely fascinating. And in fact, it came up last week. We were talking about the same. Well, there's the story of the boy who's abused who comes in. But one of the things that we didn't talk about and came up in conversing with this person after the sermon, because they were asking, can you clarify, this idea of truth that Bonhoeffer is working with? And again, the underpinnings for it are the concept of being persons of free responsibility, which we talked about last week. But there's another piece to it which we hadn't talked about, which is very important for understanding that whole piece, is that specifically in the example of the boy who's abused. So I'll recap real quick in case you weren't here last week. One of the stories that Bonhoeffer tells, it's not a story, it's a parable. One of the parables that Bonhoeffer uses, right, is a boy comes to school showing visible signs of abuse. The teacher asks the boy, "Is your father beating you?" And Bonhoeffer, argues that, two things. He says, number one, the boy, there might be this whole background. Like there's so many contributing factors. Like the husband might be the breadwinner for the family. So if he goes to prison or is removed from the family, that puts the family at risk of going hungry, etc. That's a factor. Also, as we know, in a modern contexts, family systems which include abuse are very complex, and the boy's relationship with his father, in spite of the physical abuse, is not something that can be reduced down to a 2-minute interaction with the teacher, right? But one of the things, and we didn't talk about this last week, and it didn't come up in the sermon today, but one of the things that's important to understand is that Bonhoeffer, advocates in that moment that for the boy, the truthful word might be no, right? I'm not being abused. But the follow-up to that is Bonhoeffer makes the argument that actually it's impossible for the boy to tell the truth in that circumstance. And the reason that it's important to understand that is he says this is one of our primary calls as Christians, is to make sure that it's always possible for people to tell the truth, right? Again, in this specific situation, this boy can't tell the truth because of this messed up family system wherein, and who knows what's driving, and not that there's any justification for physical abuse, but who knows what's driving that, right? It could be alcoholism, it could be stress and other things, it could be the culture that the father comes from, okay? But Bonhoeffer, essentially advocates that we need to be working constantly to make sure that in every situation we are able to tell the truth. So like a modern version of this, which certainly wasn't in his imagination when he was writing this, but a modern version of this is, for example, the 15-year-old that's struggling with their sexuality but is afraid to tell their parents because they know how that might impact their relationship with their parents. And so Bonhoeffer would argue, if you pulled him forward 60, 70 years, I think that what we are called to do is make sure it's possible for that 15-year-old to be authentically themselves, to be able to tell the truth, right? Which means, and certainly there are many Christian traditions who would disagree vehemently with this, but this is part of our welcoming statement. This is part of why, we went through the REC process, is that we should be advocating that person should be able to be who they are and celebrate who they are, right? And be celebrated in that moment in such a way that they don't have fear of telling the truth about who they are in that relationship, right? Does that kind of make sense? Does that make sense? And it goes, that has repercussions in so far as how we think about our relationship with God. Because, and this is, Bonhoeffer really, really belabors this, is he says, one of the reasons that it's important for us to advocate for truth-telling, right? In other words, to enable people to be authentic, but also to tell the truth, is that when we have people who are ashamed of who they are, so much so that they think God wants them to be a different person, we have irrevocably harmed their relationship with the divine, right? And he says that's the sin that's unforgivable. That's when you hang a millstone from your neck and throw it into the sea, is when you enforce an image of God on somebody that says, God does not like you for who you are. You need to be this person, or you need to be this way. That's when he's like, that's bad. That makes sense. Jill.
I want to share one of my homeless people. He is a gay gentleman. He was told that he was absolutely accepted and welcomed in his family, except he was not able to be seen socializing with people of the same gender because that was a problem, and he was not allowed to be around the remaining family's children. So long as he had no social ties, he was accepting, and he was accepted. And the isolation was terrible.
Yeah.
And he is homeless because he knew that his well-being couldn't be in isolation, away from regular humans, in a non-sexual manner.
Yeah.
And he is accused of not taking personal responsibility for the identity that he is.
Yeah, that's a perfect example. And there are so many more similar stories like that of the repercussions of what happens when you don't, well, and it's so tough, but when people are not allowed to be fully themselves. And this gets way off into a tangent, but this is a point for me as well too, is that a lot of the ways that modern Christianity in all of its flavors have tried to deal with this specific topic is to do a bunch of footnotes, right? Like, well, we love you for who you are, except here's how we fit you into our system. We love and welcome you, except, right? And so that's how, and this is exactly, by the way, what is the idea behind the sermon is that you're creating this false notion of who you are as a community at that point. We're a welcoming community is the lie that we tell to the world. In doing so, you prevent your understanding of your community to be critiqued and conflicted, right?
Wouldn't this be the same as you can be allowed to be a pastor, but you can't?
Totally. Totally. 100%. 100%. Yeah, I mean, it's not, and again, sexuality is the modern modern issue at front and center. But I would argue this is one. Again, I'm biased, being married and a pastor, but I would argue this is one of the longest running cardinal sins of the church is forcing people to not be sexual beings, right? You can't. You can't. You can repress that, and we see what happens when you repress that is it then manifests in unhealthy ways. But you can't stop people from being human beings, right? Which is what priestly celibacy, in my argument, does.
Yes, I was just ruminating on your sermon, and the part that came across to me was really one of judging.
Yeah.
And how that interjects with human frailty.
Yeah.
And whether you're doing it, why are you judging everyone, and yet you don't want to be judged with your frailties, and you do the opposite.
Totally. Totally.
And it's really that dilemma, that dichotomy that gets the human person into a big, big stew of hot water.
And so often it's projection as well too, right? I mean, we see this a lot in our modern context. It's so often the people calling out the sin are guilty of it themselves. Yeah, and projecting. Paula, you're.
I had a campaigner come to the door a few weeks ago promoting a candidate who was a woman.
Yep.
For a high position in Oregon.
Yeah.
At the end of her presentation, and I listened to her.
Yeah.
We conversed. She said, and she's gay, and she went on, and I almost wanted to say to her, why did you have to say? Why did you even have to say that? Well, so it's still. Can I still be accepted?
Yeah. And
I still have to. I don't know.
And sorry when I took us on this tangent, but I mean that's and the thing is too is I'm sure that there are arguments that come from all directions on that. Like one of which you probably why does that not need to be said? Well, am I supposed to vote for that person specifically because of that? You'll hear that end of it. But on the other hand, it's the same in my mind, and this is actually I have to be careful about equivocating things, but it's similar to the black person who drives past a police officer and suddenly needs to check to make sure they're not, it's because yes, we might not think that it's something that they should worry about, but you know what? Yeah, she does need to say that, right? And yeah, well, but again, going back to Bonhoeffer, this is, I think Bonhoeffer would, and by extension, theoretically, Jesus as well too, would advocate that a better, healthier society is one where we don't need those qualifiers, right? Where we are able to be who we are, and there are no ifs, ands, or buts about that. Now, and the thing that's unspoken here, which further complicates things, is that's exactly what I need to do now that we've gone on a 20-minute tangent. But But the other piece in that as well is acknowledging that the authentic us is a sinful, us as well too. And the way we get hung up on that in a modern context is we immediately associate that with bad, right? Like you're telling me I'm wrong or something like this. Like, no, but there's a really important part of being able to understand forgiveness and redemption and being human, right? Because if we are unable to acknowledge the busted parts of ourselves, we're not able to fix those parts, right? And they might not be things that we can fix, right? But they are things that need to be redeemed. And I would argue that is what redemption looks like. That's, when we talk about, the healing of all things, the tecton, right? What we're talking about, Jesus uses these scary images of needing to be cleansed by fire and stuff like that. But what we're talking about is being able to heal the brokenness that exists internally and externally. But if we pretend like those things aren't broken, then they can't be healed, right? And the way that manifests in the world, in society, is narrative, right? We see this in the news. Is we spin this narrative, right? That no, I'm not actually that thing, right? That's not broken. There's nothing wrong with that, right? Or we change the definition of things, right? There's so many tools that are available in a modern world rife with communication that enable us to ignore the brokenness that exists in ourselves and in our society. And again, this is the important part about being able to be authentic, is that when you're authentic, you're also honest about the things that are broken within you, right? And again, it's not about being a bad person, it's about being able to be healed, which is a really, really good thing, right? Being able to be forgiven and be redeemed. You also need to be able to show that brokenness. But it's super hard, right? That's the flip side of it, is it's really hard to admit that, this part, that there's this part of me which probably isn't a great thing to have, right? Or there's this behavior or whatever, right? And so, and the way I always think about it is like when somebody points it out, right? What's your gut reaction? Your gut reaction is to say, no, I'm not like that. or you get angry and what do? You then project it back on them. It's fascinating. I absolutely love this stuff. I mean, it's awful in some ways, but I absolutely love talking about it because it's really an interesting conversation. Anyway, sorry.
I was just going to say, though, we grow as we get older, and sometimes the culture you come from, you're not even aware you had
totally.
prejudice and stuff, and then
totally.
You start looking at it from a different point of view.
Totally.
Yeah.
And that's more important than ever. To be able to be authentic is to be able to without shame, right? Without using the pressure relief valve of guilt, right? Is to be able to say, oh, you know what? I'm 40 years old, and it just occurs to me that that's maybe not an appropriate thing to say in this case. I should work on that part. I should maybe excise that from my behavior. And maybe the underlying factor there is a conception that I inherited from my culture, but isn't actually a healthy conception, right? I mean, I'm a millennial, and I will be honest, understanding the nuances of sexuality in the modern world is tough. I mean, we talked about this when we went through the REC process. But I'm on the waning edge of millennials, right? So that's part of it. But if you talk to, our teenagers, they navigate that world so much more fluently than we do. But I have some hard edges there to round over yet. I still, and the thing is when I don't understand things, I start to get judgmental about them as well too. Anybody else catch themselves doing that? Right?
Well, you can't batter the people that came before you in your family because they came out of it
Absolutely.
tougher way.
Absolutely. It's a two-way street. On one hand, we want to encourage people to be able to be honest about who they are and to look critically on some of their parts. But on the other hand, there is a threshold at which you are simply causing people to bury their heads in the sand, right? Which your need, and you mentioned this, Andy, your need to call out judgment is actually maybe because you've got stuff that you need to work on, right? And so yeah, it's a dance. I mean, but again, Jesus is the one that can heal the world, not us. But it doesn't mean that we can't help. Anyway, sorry. Good conversation. I always need to talk about my sermons after the fact, anyways. It's ego. It's ego. Okay. What's that? It's sin. It is sin. Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm an authentic, honest person. Okay, let's talk about restitution, which is where we, or no, we finished restitution, didn't we?
Yes.
Thank goodness. Social slash, oh my goodness, slash religious slash family. This is where it gets good. This is the fun stuff.
So where are
We are in 22 now, I think.
Yes.
22 verse 16.
In which?
Exodus. And this is really the piece that I wanted to get to all along, this injustice.
Yes.
Because this is the stuff, right? This bears relevance to the topic of conversation that we just finished. This whole thing, I'm smarter than I know. It's all a lead in to talking about this. Okay, verse 16. Again, contrast this with the other codexes that we looked at. When a man seduces a virgin who is not engaged to be married, okay, understand the qualifiers, and lies with her, he shall give the bride price for her and make her his wife. Oh boy. Okay, so to clarify, if a man rapes a virgin who is not pledged to somebody, she becomes his wife. David and Bathsheba, anyone? Right? Okay. How many things are wrong here? All of them, right? All of them, especially from a modern understanding, right? Where, in a post-Me Too world, in a world where we teach our children and our grandchildren the importance of, obtaining consent is the word I was looking for. Obtaining consent in any romantic relationship. Holy Lord, is this a hard one to deal with? And that's not a but. But negates the clause that came before it. And harken back to the other codexes and how they dealt with similar things. And I don't remember which is which at this point, but one of the other ones is a man who lies with a virgin, pays a fine, right? Which you could argue is actually a little more just because you're not forcing the abused to marry their abuser, right? But here's where we have relevance in modern context, right? Is have we not heard proposals for laws regarding this specific thing, not in the state of Oregon, thankfully, but in other states or what's the other word? Commonwealths within the United States. Not quite at this same level, but all having to do with what happens if a man rapes a woman who is pregnant with that man's child, and the law, as proposed, sides with allowing the man a relationship with the child, despite the crime that has been committed, and in some cases forcing the woman to carry the pregnancy to term, regardless of her voice in the matter, right? So, again, not to belabor the point, but were you of a mind, you could make the argument that those proposed laws are biblically based, because right here, okay? Now, many of us, I don't assume homogeneity of political and or social opinion in here, but I would assume at least, that we perhaps are in some agreement that forcing a woman who has been raped into any sort of relationship with her abuser is bad, right? Never mind the complexities of childbearing and all that stuff. But we would hopefully draw a line there, okay? much less telling her that she had to marry the guy. And yet, there are people who claim the Christian tradition who are advocating for this very thing, okay? And it's in our Bible, right? So how do we deal with this? This is the conversation that we're having. Okay, let's move on. We can come back to these things. Matt, go ahead.
Well, if you don't interpret the word seduce to be rape, just simple.
Well, yes, right.
This was actually when I was a teenager, say.
Yeah.
This was extremely common.
Oh, totally. Absolutely.
If you know, a young girl in high school got pregnant.
Yep.
She had a boyfriend.
Absolutely.
They had to get married. It was called shotgun wedding.
Absolutely.
And I have personal friends.
Same here.
That's exactly what they did.
Same here. I have personal friends who are now on their second marriage because that was how their first marriage got started, was you know, teenage pregnancy. Absolutely, 100%. And Alpena, Michigan, very, not that this is a judgment or anything, but very Catholic as well too. So you can understand that the views on abortion were much more in that line. But very good point, Matt. Very good point.
But if they didn't get married, then the girl's reputation was ruined forever. She had to
Exactly.
leave town, and
Exactly.
there was nothing against the guy.
Absolutely. Yeah. And again, so I mean, but, oh man, this is awful and wonderful, but like, yeah, the word seduce, read from a male perspective, right, sounds rather tame, right? But in this case, we would be the ones doing the seducing. From a woman's perspective, you know, how many of you like to be seduced by strangers? Or, I mean, and again, but this is the tough part, is that, you know, how many teenagers do something that they regret 15 seconds later? All the time. That's what it's like being a teenager, right? Is that your body does things before your brain even processes them. Susan.
I've read that the majority of teen pregnancies are, the man is actually in his 20s. So
Oh, man.
There are the 18-year-olds who are getting together, but then
Sure.
there are these older guys seducing.
Absolutely.
And that's why we have laws about statutory.
Absolutely. Okay, I'll repeat so Susan read something that the majority of teenage pregnancies are actually older men in their 20s impregnating women in their teens. That is actually the most frequent occurrence of teenage pregnancy. It does not surprise me at all. And then again, like in a post-Me Too world, this is a conversation around consent. Is consent possible in a situation of power over, right? So a 22-year-old who's got a car and a job, you know, who can drink, buy booze, you know, has, you know, cigarettes, and a 16, 17-year-old girl who, I wasn't a girl, but I was 17 once, right? I was not a fully functioning, thinking human being at that point in time. And I am so glad that cell phone cameras with video recording options were not around at any point during my youth, because I would never be employable. I would not be, no, I'm kidding. I was actually a really good kid most of the time. But good Lord, when I was 17, yeah, 22, I mean, it's different being a guy, but I looked up, you know, people who were 22 were adults, right? If you were 30, you were old. I couldn't imagine being 30. 40, your grandparent, right? You know. So yeah, I mean, this is again perfect example of how when you point at something and say, well, but the Bible says this, it takes so few things into consideration, even disregarding contextual differences, right? Again, what does seduce mean, and does seduce, you know, so in a society where it's primarily male voices are celebrated, is there even an option for a woman who was seduced, right? No.
I understand if you're a girl in times of puberty to be seduced. What I don't understand at all is if your property,
Yeah.
either of your parent
Yeah.
or the man that you're having sex with,
Yeah.
what consent even means. I don't understand how that works.
Okay, this, so Jill is asking, in a society where you are functionally property either of your father or the man who you are married, what does consent even look like in that context, right? Spoiler alert, it doesn't, right? That does not exist in the consciousness of these folks. And yet it does to some extent. But I would argue this is why, I mean, again, the law, male-dominated, writing here. This is why, to a certain extent, the law, I think, sides so often on the adulterer being the woman as well. It's because the language is so male-dominated. But in a world where consent doesn't really exist, this is why you get your daughter married as soon as possible, right? Because an unwedded woman in adulthood, and again, adulthood occurred much earlier than it does in a modern context, is dangerous, right? Because of this exact thing, right? In a world where consent doesn't really happen, if she has a romantic relationship with a man and they are not married, there is no good outcome, right? Unless the man decides that he wants to continue the relationship, okay? This is why every circumstance, the law, even in all the other codexes as well too, right? It's the woman who is the adulterer with regards to law. It's not the man. Do you understand? Does that make sense?
Yeah, but you have to also remember that the whole way of thinking of a woman in that period would be no worth, and you wouldn't have any say. So
Yeah.
whatever the
Totally.
male population was doing was what you had to do, I would think.
Totally, absolutely, right? And there is a lot of nuance to that, which is important. But on the balance, yeah, women historically in ancient societies were in fact not only not of value, but could be seen as a debit, right? Because with dowries and all that. I mean, essentially, you're convincing somebody else to buy your daughter, or you're selling. Again. Now, the thing that is important to carry through here is the human element of it, which is that this doesn't mean that fathers didn't love their daughters and mothers didn't love their daughters and that they didn't celebrate them. But when your societal structure is this, right? Again, we talked about the same thing with regard to child abuse. All of the protection for a woman in this case has to do with her family. Okay, it has to do with having fathers and brothers who value you and are willing to protect you, right? Because world wasn't that different 3,000 years ago in some ways. Human beings are still human beings. Teenagers were fooling around in the back of dad's, carriage or whatever, wagon, ox-drawn cart, before they got married, right? But the law was pretty firm in whose side it fell on, right? Which again, so nowadays we talk about having the conversation with our kids, especially our young men, about determining consent, right? I mean, hopefully fathers are having that conversation with their sons, and vice versa, a different conversation with daughters about the consequences of sexual relationships and how they can be lifelong decisions. I imagine that there were not similar, but of the same category of conversations that were had in third millennia Israel, right? Around, Sarah, don't hang out with that boy. He's no good, and we don't want our family connected to theirs. That type of thing. So, Andy.
So then, in juxtaposition to this statement, in all contexts, when Jesus basically said, "Those without sin, cast
the first stone."
You couldn't get worse. You couldn't get a better juxtaposition.
Oh man, I'm so excited about this. Because there are so many awkward stories, there are so many awkward passages in the Bible where, again, if you educate yourself on the legal underpinnings of that society, you understand the nuance of what's going on there. This story, the story of the woman caught in adultery, right? And he says, "Where's the man?" First, foremost, it's not a question they ever considered, right? Because the law doesn't care about the man, right? The law only cares about the woman in this case. The women are the ones that adulter. Men just they have children slightly before they get married to their eventually wife, or they deny, and nobody's going to listen anyway. But then additionally, again, there's Jesus being confronted on marriage, right? And he says, when God joined you together, two flesh became one. And it's a much longer conversation that exists behind that around the consequences of divorce in first century Israel, and how, again, we look at this set of laws. Are there any protections for women? No, and not in divorce either. It's even worse. And so, you have this rabbinical debate that existed during Jesus' time around what were the valid reasons for abandoning your wife, essentially. But if you don't understand that, then you take a text like that and you justify all of the horrible marriages that should have ended long when the relationship ended, or when abuse was discovered, and yet we've used the Bible in this case to act as a judgmental, authoritative force to encourage unhealthy relationships. I mean, it's like, man, this, again, take everything that I'm saying through the lens of Jesse is a Bible nerd and absolutely enjoys kind of the logical, uncovering the context and figuring out the consequences of that. So that's why I get so worked up about this. But also, yeah, anyways, okay.
Well, there's one other aspect I was thinking of. If there was a woman that was not engaged, she may come from a poor family that doesn't even have enough dowry for her to, so she's kind of left hanging out there anyway.
Well, and that's where verse 17 comes in, right? So here's the but. But if the father refuses to give her to him, he shall pay an amount equal to the bride price for virgins. Who's paying? Daddy's paying.
Oh, really?
Daddy's paying.
To the guy that raped her.
Hold on, I'm rethinking that now. Direct objects are so important in grammar.
Yeah, who's the he? Yeah.
I'm guessing the he is probably the man.
So who is he paying?
The dad. Well, because he spoiled the daughter. She's damaged goods now. She's pregnant. Well, not necessarily pregnant, but she's, yeah.
In this example, that's not the issue. The issue is the father isn't consenting to
Totally.
marriage.
Totally.
And so the guy who wants to marry the daughter said, "Fine, I'll just pay you her price and I'll just take her anyway."
And I wonder if this was to cover a loophole.
He, I can't tell who is.
Because I wonder if this is to cover potentially the taking a woman by force loophole. But on the other hand, it's essentially prostitution, right? I mean, you pay the price,
But
unconsenting, but
again, the context is where you're
yeah, totally.
It's kind of hard to take that forward to our current society.
Totally, it is, yeah. And half the time I wonder if it's even worth the amount of brain power I put into trying to figure this out. But on the other hand, it just kind of again reinforces the context, Susan.
Wait till you get to 18.
Yeah, well, it gets worse.
I just want to leave open that he in that sentence is not clear to me.
I rereading it. It's got to be the boy or the man who did the seduction.
He didn't say he did anything. He just said he wants to marry her.
Yeah.
He didn't say he did anything.
Yeah.
He just said he wants to marry her.
Seduce is
And
not necessarily
the
rape.
father does not want to allow that.
Yeah.
So there's no guilt here.
Well, I think there is. I think it's implied that he seduced her. I think it's implied that they laid together. They knew each other. They yadad, biblically.
That is implied that may or may not be factual.
Yeah, I know.
But the
But
father
the point
has the
being,
power.
the virginity was such a big deal.
Absolutely.
So
And-
why would a dad not accept it? Because then he's got this daughter
and here's yet another thing to think about, right? In modern contextualization is true or false, issues around virginity in premarital sexual relationships continue to be an ethical and moral conundrum in modern society. Absolutely. And for good reason, right? And for good reason, because of the teenagers and not being fully developed. And yet, how much has that been a wedge that has been driven into families, right? For example, how many of you know or have children or grandchildren who are questioning whether or not to get married, right? If marriage is a religious institution, it's also a legal one, which is an important aspect of it as well. But because it's 2022, also society has begun to somewhat, leave those hang-ups behind. But how many, are like, well, why should I pay, on average $27,000 for a party that I have to invite a bunch of people that I don't even really want to have there? I'm not talking about my marriage at all, by the way. but I mean, it's a thing, right? So I mean, how many of us know or have kids or grandkids in that realm, and yet maybe in the back of your brains you're going, but I really want them to get married. Yeah. And that's a complex conversation as well too. And I'm now regretting bringing this in because this is going to be another 25-minute conversation. But it's Elena and I had to have this conversation when we were dating because and I don't want to give too much of her personal information away without asking her consent on it. But she, in adulthood especially, was convinced she never wanted to get married. There were several reasons for that. One was in French society, marriage is held firmly in the hands of the Catholic Church, right? So much so that people who don't even go to church will obtain the permit through the state, get married by a priest, right? Because that's the easiest process. Historically, things have changed recently. Now they have what's called PACS, which is essentially marriage without going through the church. But because the Catholic Church owned the property that was marriage, especially in the last 20 years, the rate of marriage in French culture has dwindled significantly, right? Now with PACS, if you're equating those two things, it's gone the other direction. But for her, right, that was one piece. There were some family dynamics pieces as well too. And so we had to have a conversation about, well, do you want to get married? And what does that look like? And she asked me specifically, why did I want to get married? That was not a question about the committedness of our relationship. It was a question about whether we were going to go through this process, right? So, it's not just your grandkids. Anyways, but again, the reason I brought it up is so many of our societal issues now in conversation around things that are important like this, right? Marriage and romantic relationships and committed relationships, is that we are burdened with hang-ups that come from this stuff. And Gail, you kind of, you introduced this is your fault to a certain extent, but I'm kidding. But how much of this is because how much of our struggles is due to a worry around going to hell because we had premarital relationships, right? Or again, girls getting pregnant at the age of 16 or 14, right? And entering into a long-term relationship with somebody who's potentially older than they are and who did not and does not have their best interests at heart, and yet are shackled to that person, and how much of that ends up in situations of abuse and or strife and or children that are then saddled with the consequences of two parents who really shouldn't have been together in the first place. I mean, how many of the things that we struggle with in the modern world are because of assumptions about biblical law? Right? Again, I'm repeating myself. I'm repeating myself ad nauseum, especially after a similar conversation last week. But this is why we need to read this stuff. This is why we need to understand what was going on here. Why did these laws look like they looked like? Was it because they were in the best interest of all people involved, or was it because that was how society saw the world at that point in time?
Well, certainly the girl has no say-so in any of it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And if we want to live in a world where women have at least equal, if not more say-so, in their bodily autonomy, right, then we have to consider as well that some of our hang-ups that come from really, man, I'm losing my words already. Ridiculous, Levitical and Mosaic laws, right? If we acknowledge that linkage, then perhaps we as Christians, right, can see a path forward being informed about where those hang-ups come from.
We have to change our language. How many times
Yeah.
She is a mother out of wedlock.
Absolutely.
But have you ever heard he's a father out of wedlock?
He's a baby daddy.
Yeah.
Yep. And
So in all this
yeah.
that's been going on, and I've said this before, but I want to reiterate it right now, and it is in this culture
Yeah.
where you have the unequal status of the woman
Yeah.
in terms of the lower person, and
Yeah.
it shows up in all
Yep.
the laws.
Yep.
Yet in that same society, the more core of the religious practices starts with the woman.
Yeah.
Has to light the candle and
Yes.
bring in the Holy Spirit. It's
Yeah.
like, look
In the
at
Jewish
this.
marriage tradition, yes.
Yeah, you look at this. It's like, it's incredible that you have all this going on negatively, yet that same person who is destroyed is the single thing that brings everything forward. And
if you look further into Jewish wedding traditions, and I don't know how much of this is more recent, but I suspect, because this tends to be how ceremonies in Judaism function, which is that no, they're all ancient. It's not, they don't necessarily create new things. It's all based on ancient practices. But like the marriage, has anybody seen like the marriage certificate art for the Jewish wedding contract? Absolutely gorgeous stuff that both people signed at the bottom. Is that, and we're going to get there as well, is that here's the legal system. This legal system, as we've seen, is eerily similar to many other legal systems that existed in this region at this time, in cultures that were in conversation with each other, right? So again, without just saying it plainly, by and large, a lot of the Mosaic law is stolen from the Babylonians, right? They took that legal code and made it themselves, which was stolen from the city of Ur, right? And then that's not stolen, it's just that, in fact, the legal systems existed across, that was the legal system of that region, right? It was how everybody functioned. They based their laws on other laws because they worked. And what we're paying attention to in here isn't just the legal code, because again, this is part of being a Jesus person, is we're also claiming that at least in some regard, this is divinely inspired, right? That God is in this somehow. And so we can point to traditions where, again, the Jewish marriage ceremony, despite existing in a legal framework that is very unequal with regard to genders, has these elements of it which shout co-equality in the relationship, right? And that have carried, have stood the test of time. We are going to continue to see these things where the law says this, and yet the practices of the people seem to belie what exists in the law. Okay? Example that comes to mind. Well, and it's one of the more awful stories in the biblical witness. You know, Judah and Tamar, right? I bring this one all the time, so sorry, I'm repeating it. So the law, the Levitical law, it's not in the Exodus law. The Levitical law states that, and this is in Genesis, so it's technically pre-Levitical law, but that's a much longer conversation. The law states that when a woman's husband dies, she marries the next brother, right? That it's the responsibility of the husband's family to provide a son for her so that that son can inherit the property of his father, okay? So the law states that she marries the husband who gets a child by her, that child inherits the father's stuff. So I know, it's crazy, but this is the way it works. So Tamar's husband dies, and no brother, he's got, I can't remember how many sons Judah had, like 3 or 4 or 8 or something like that. None of them are promised to her in marriage. So what this means, right, is that her husband's stuff, which she can't own, hangs there in limbo, which means actually it becomes the family's. She loses it, even though the law protects her in that regard, right? And she doesn't have a child at this point. That's an important fact. So what she does is she seduces Judah, right, through a weird, wild series of events, who gets a child by her, right? And then when Judah, like a typical guy, tries to call her out for adultery, right, she holds up his personal belongings and says, oh, but whose are these? And then all of a sudden Judah's like, oh, okay, maybe I should marry you to my next son, right? So this is a story that's in our scripture, meaning it's a story that is so celebrated by people that when all this stuff finally gets written down after the exile, right? It's 4th century BCE, when they finally decide we should probably put this stuff in writing. This is a story that makes it into the Genesis narrative, that celebrates a woman who utilizes this archaic, weird, from a modern context, law, but uses it widely, uses it in this really deceptive manner in order to make sure that the thing that was supposed to have been done is done, right? That's in our biblical narrative as well, alongside this weird archaic law, right? So, an important question to ask there is, why? Why is that story so important that it's included in the biblical witness? A conclusion that you could draw is that the Hebrew people were able to make a distinction from between the law and between life, right? How you navigated the world and the law. And that in this case, they celebrated a woman who was the righteous one in this circumstance, even though she had to be unrighteous in order to have the law done, right? This is a story that stands right alongside all of this other stuff. Those are the things that we've got to pay attention to. But if you don't understand the legal underpinnings of that, you're hopeless. It just sounds like a weird story, right? Anyways.
Would a rabbi come into this as being sort of a counselor in some of these
No.
cases?
Nope, no rabbis.
Oh, at this point, all right.
Yep, no rabbis at this point. Rabbis come much later. Yeah. Okay, it's 12.
I have one question.
Go.
18.
Well, okay, so I was going to wrap up with 18. And so this is a foretaste of the feast to come, so to speak. Okay, so let's just real quick. Verse 18, you shall not permit a female sorcerer to live. What about warlocks or male sorcerers?
Is it a non sequitur or is it the same concept?
This is the question that I want you to think about until next Sunday. Because it's followed up by, whoever lies with an animal shall put to death. What? What does that have to do with anything else? Whoever sacrifices to any god other than the Lord shall be devoted to destruction. What does the devoted to destruction mean? Does that mean put to death? Why didn't they just say put to death? And then, well, we're skipping forward, but then the very next verse, which is the one that I quoted a couple weeks ago, you shall not wrong or oppress a resident alien, For you were aliens in the land of Egypt. You shall not abuse any widow or orphan. If you do abuse them, when they cry out to me, I will surely hear their cry. My wrath will burn, and I will kill you with the sword, and your wives shall become widows, and your children orphans. So we just had these three weird grab bags of laws, right? Like women sorcerers, not males, lying with animals, and sacrificing to other gods. And all of a sudden, record scratch, and we have the direct voice of God, seemingly, speaking into this text, announcing that you need to remember the widows, orphans, and foreigners in your land. What's going on? So that's your homework. Think about it. There's not an answer, by the way. I want you to think about it. Okay. Whew, boy, that second cup of coffee was a bad idea.